Hi everyone, it is Dr. C. Nityanandam, Associate Professor in Mechanical Engineering Department. Today we are going to learn about the chapter of friction in Engineering Mechanics subject. Now we go to the what is mean by the friction, what are all the friction applications and how to make the frictional force and how to rectify the friction. Then what are the applications and limitations of the friction. The first we go to the introduction. What is a friction? How to create the friction? When two surfaces, see the diagram, the two rough surfaces in contact move against each other. A force is exerted between them that resists this motion. So this resist force is called as a friction force. Here you see the friction acts always parallel to the surface or contact. The direction that friction that opposite the direction of motion. Here the small example is given. See that one more the block is provided in between the two rough surfaces. So the block is now applying the force, the pushing force. The pushing force is applying on the block. Now what will happen? Now the block or object is start a motion. So the direction of motion is mentioned here, and then naturally the oppositive force, that means called as a naturally induced friction force. So this friction force is acting always the opposite direction of the motion. So this is a basic concept, but when the 100% smooth surface is impossible to make it. Anything, any wall or floor, anyone. Suppose if you have to making 100% smooth, what will happen? Surely we slip out. We are not standing, we are not moving any position. So the frictional force is very important in our daily life. So without the friction force, impossible to move on it, stand on it, when the floor is 100% smooth. So we have to avoid 100% smooth, we have to making some rough surface. So this rough surface only to produce the frictional force. Okay, what are the various types of friction? So the friction are basically classified into two types. One is a wet friction and a dry friction. Wet friction means when you take the shaft and the sleeve, in between the shaft and the sleeve we have to fill the lubrication oil. What is the purpose of the lubrication oil? This will be reduce the wear and tear of the shaft. So that friction is called as a wet friction. So the dry friction is a force of friction between two solid surfaces in contact. See this diagram, when the force P is applied on the object, this total weight is acting vertically downward. Here the block is mounted on the rough surface. So automatically the opposite direction of motion is frictional force is naturally induced. Then the total weight is always acting towards the center of the object, so acting vertically downward. Automatically the reactive force or the oppositive force is induced from vertically upward. So we always this frictional force is based on the normal reaction. So classifications are dry friction. So first one is a classification static friction. When the block remains stationary, How, sir? See the diagram. The rough surfaces placed on one more the block. So this block total weight is acting vertically downward towards the centroid point. And then opposite, it is having always the opposite reaction force. That means the normal reaction. And another one is now applied force. That means the FA. Now the block is not movable. Because the reason is FA is equal to the F small a. That means static friction. That means applied force and also the frictional force is equal. The object will be in the static condition. Similarly, for the next one is a kinetic friction or dynamic friction. Now here the block is in moving condition or motion. See that it is having again the two different types. One is a sliding friction. Now the same concept is given here, but one more different is now the block is in motion. So these are the two different categories. Now this is called as a sliding friction. How, sir? When the force is applying to the block, now the block is in the motion, automatically the static surfaces are generating the friction force. So this friction force, in this friction force, we talked about when the value of the applying force and the opposite force is not equal. So we have to turn the rough surface, this will be started sliding. So that is called as a sliding motion. So the sliding friction, always the direction of the motion is always in the opposite direction of the frictional force. Both are not equal. And similarly for the another one, that is called as a rolling friction. So the bottom side, the object are placed on which one? Roller. So when it is called as the same thing is when the rolling friction, the block is also rolled on the rough surface. And then next one, this is examples of friction. What is that? First, static friction. When the applied force is given, box remains stationary, because the reason is applied force and static force is static frictional force is equal. And then it is an example for the rolling friction. When the bicycle is a best example, the total weight will be acting vertically downward in centroid point, and the normal reactions are there. And then when the force is applying to the pedal, when the direction of motion is in the forward, automatically the frictional force is producing in between of the floor and wheel. Then the kinetic friction, now the force is applied on the left hand side, now the box will be moves towards the right side. So it is called as a kinetic or dynamic friction. Then what is a law of friction? So when the law of friction, take the rough surface and one more the object, the square block maybe. Now what are all the forces are applying it? What is the law of friction? Now the law of friction is mentioned by using our Newton's second law. So Newton's second law, what told? When the force is directly proportional to the acceleration. Here the frictional force is directly proportional to the normal reaction. So we have to equating it with one constant. So the small f is friction force, that is equal to mu into n. Mu is a frictional coefficient. Same thing for the kinetic friction. Both the limiting friction is F is directly proportional to the normal reaction. It is a friction law. And then what is a limiting friction? Limiting friction means this is applicable for only the static friction because the applied force and the frictional force is also equal. So that is called as a limiting friction. Then what is the angle of friction? So the angle of friction is, we have to making some resolution in the block. It is a block center. When the D is here, A, B, C is mentioned here. So one is taking the inclination of the force. Sometimes when the applied force will be in inclined position, it is having some angle. So we have to making this inclined portion into resultant force. So how to convert this? We take the resolution. So horizontally and vertically, horizontally is a negative, then vertically is a upward, positive. So consider this triangle. Triangle OBC, triangle OAC. So we have to calculate this angle tan alpha equal to BC by OB and or tan alpha equal to OA by OB. Substitute these values FC by R. So it is a coefficient of limiting friction is always equal to the tangent of the angle of friction. So it is a tan alpha is equal to mu. Mu is a coefficient of friction. And then what is a coefficient of friction? It is called as a same concept is applied here. So when the block is placed on the rough surface, we have to calculate the coefficient of friction by using the frictional law. F equal to mu n. So therefore mu equal to F by n. So this mu is a coefficient of friction. Then the advantages. We are having lot of applications in the world. Something will be given only for. The first one is striking a matchstick. When the friction force is not induced, it will not ignite it. Similarly, for the spiked shoes of cricket players, we know what is a spiked. So this will be very rigid in the surface, our ground surface. What is the reason? The ground surface is always rough surface. So this will be also to given some normal reactive force in the opposite direction. So the frictional force will be resist the spiked shoes of cricket player. So we can easily balance it. And then we are able to drive automobiles. So the automobile is one place to another place. The car or any vehicle is moving it. So without frictional force, we are not to be balanced the automobile field. Take a car, it is having 4 wheels. Wheel is fixed with a tire. So this tire is frictional force is induced because the reason is a rough surface and then the rolling resistance. So without frictional force, there is no automobile. And then another one is a writing on paper. Writing on paper. Suppose when your pen is given in the point, single point, and the paper is not a 100% smooth. We know the 100% smooth paper, we can't write it. So it is having some rough surfaces. Easily to write on paper. Some limitations. What is the limitations? Friction force is always produces the more amount of heat. So friction wears out the roughing surface. And also when the frictional force is increased, the friction produces the noise. So these 3 are the disadvantages of friction. What is the output? Wear and tear of object. And then how to reduces the which one? Friction. Applying the lubricants in between two frictional surfaces and applying the oil in the hinges. Say for example, the hinges is just pivoted. So we have to applying the oil or lubrication in any movable part, we can reduce the wear and tear. And then polishing the surfaces. See that it is a rough surfaces, not a 100% smooth. Suppose when the rough surfaces, when the human weight is acting on it, so this will be continuously using of it. So the frictional output, this will be given the wear and tear. So we have to avoid the wear and tear. We have to polish in the surface. And then the ordinary suitcase. So we have to add in 4 wheels. We have to reduce the direct contact to the suitcase and the earth surface. So we have to minimize the or reduce the friction force. Thank you.